Welcome to the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach, and I'm joined today by my guest, Bobby Skafish.
Hey, good to be here.
Bobby, welcome. Bobby's known around the Chicago area as a disc jockey, most at WXRT, but also at WLUP, WKQX, and WDRV.
Yeah.
And he has a book that just came out. You want to give us a brief rundown on that?
Sure, it's called We Have Company, 4 Decades of Rock and Roll Encounters. We Have Company was just a phrase I would tend to use on the radio when we had a guest coming in.
Sure.
So that's where that comes from. So it's mostly radio. It starts with a few pre-radio stories that were rock and roll encounters, though.
Yeah, very good. And some of these are Chicago area musicians, and some are, and others are people who were coming through Chicago at least, right?
Yeah, more often than that,
and
actually.
people you had the opportunity to interview.
Yeah.
What was your most surprising interview or encounter with a rock star?
Surprising? I'll tell you what, there was a female duo called the Indigo Girls.
Sure, I remember that.
And they're, I guess feminists would be an accurate term, and
Yeah.
I feared that they might be humorless, but it was the exact opposite. Super friendly,
Yeah.
We had a lot of laughs, bonded really well, so that was a very pleasant surprise. And most of the encounters were pleasant by their very nature. David Bowie was a real gentleman. I interviewed him over the phone once, and that went well because he's such a sharp guy. He was, great mind.
Yeah.
And then I had an opportunity to have my picture taken with him with a bunch of radio people after a concert. And he epitomized manners in that he made everyone feel comfortable. He made all of us who were nervous to be around David Bowie, he made us all feel comfortable, and it sticks with me.
Yeah, he was a unique figure. Yeah. Let's talk about growing up in Chicago for a minute. We're both baby boomers, aging baby boomers at this point, right? The music scene in Chicago for the early part of our lives was dominated by WLS and WCFL, right?
Sure, yeah, that's what I grew up with, even pre-Beatle era.
Yeah. Well, let's look at that pre-Beatle era for a second.
Sure.
How do you characterize that? Everybody knew things changed radically, but I don't know if we've spent much time thinking about where we were before that change happened.
I think it's analyzed as being sort of a teen idol era.
Yeah.
Yeah, Frankie Avalon and acts of that nature, kind of more prefabricated stars than bands with guitars who wrote their own music.
Yeah.
It's a teen idol era.
Yeah, and a lot of music being generated out of music writing mills, basically, in New York, Tin Pan Alley, places like that, right? It seems to me there were a couple other movements there. One was the beginning of the folk revival movement, which I guess pretty much started with Tom Dooley by the Kingston Trio, and the other was and again another band that was trying to associate themselves with Jamaica and Kingston, the Kinks, after the British invasion started, and then the King's Men with Louie Louie, which I think I read was the last #1 hit before I Want to Hold Your Hand, probably.
Really?
It was the first Beatles record.
Wow, you're ahead of me on that one.
Yeah, but I mean, so what was something going on there? Was there some grassroots things happening? Do you think?
There was like you say, there was a folk movement in the early '60s.
Yeah.
Dylan started pre-Beatles. Actually, so did the Beach Boys.
Yeah.
But I think following the Kennedy assassination, America was waiting for some major release, for something new, and then for the Beatles to come out, entirely different look, entirely different sound.
Yeah.
I think that's what really clicked in '64.
Yeah. Do you remember the battle of the disc jockeys back then? I remember on WLS, there was a guy, Clark Weber, who didn't like the Beatles. He was the one who didn't like them, right?
Yeah.
And then there was Art Roberts and I don't remember.
Ron Riley would be
Ron
another
Riley,
one.
yeah. Yeah, and they were all pro Beatles. I remember every time a Beatle single came out, they would play it like 3 times every half hour for days. Yeah.
Well, that was the big new thing, so
Yeah.
of course.
Have you've met some of those people over the years, I'm sure.
Radio
right?
people?
Yeah, those early radio people.
Yeah, I mean, I would consider myself friends with John Landecker from WLS.
Yeah, I remember John Landecker.
And, Larry Lujak was a guy I admired. I never did meet. Larry Lujak once said something on the air that was so cool.
Yeah.
He goes, "Boy, this station sounds good when I'm on it." I'm thinking that's you need that kind of confidence, whether or not you have the nerve to say it the way Lujak did. It was really cool to hear someone say that.
Yeah, one of the interesting phenomena on Chicago radio was when CFL switched over to a different format.
Yeah.
And from what I heard, they couldn't fire him because of his contract, and he kept going on, and he was making some very sarcastic comments about the music he was playing. I listened a few times, but just to catch what he was doing.
Yeah, he had to, in order to keep his contract, he had to be an announcer for beautiful music, strings, Mantovani, that kind of thing.
Yeah. He once said that he hung around with young kids, teenagers and college-age people, because he said it kept him younger and kept him in tune. He really seemed like the first person I thought of as a professional disc jockey. He didn't seem like somebody who just kind of fell into it. It just seemed like he'd really thought through what he was doing.
Well, I'd say he was the first guy that bucked the trend of that you have to act happy and upbeat all the time.
Yeah, I guess that's right.
He'd be willing to be kind of a grouch, and he pulled it off.
Yeah, especially when he was telling animal stories.
Yeah.
Which actually turned into a record, and they. Another interesting thing, I'm just going back historically on this, and we can move on to something else. But there was somebody who was doing sports for, I think, Lujak. Was it Grobstein?
Yeah, Les Grobstein. Sure.
And he was in the Cubs locker room the day that Lee Elia went off on the fans.
Yeah, I have a recording of that.
Well, everybody does.
Yeah. Yeah, a classic, and you correctly credited Les Grobstein for.
It was Les Grobstein. He's still around, I think, right?
I think he is.
I think
he's affiliated maybe with the Score. I'm not positive on that.
Yeah.
Good guy.
Yeah. Of course, nobody could play the entire tape because it was full of explicatives. Most of them starting with F.
Yeah. But I'm happy to say I have the unexpurgated version.
Well, that's great. Yeah. And then, of course, the Chicago media scene. If you were a kid, it was Bozo and.
Sure.
What else? What were you watching as you were growing up? What were
Flash Gordon on Sunday mornings, and Bozo, of course, we all grew up on, and Family Classics with Fraser Thomas.
Fraser Thomas, yeah.
The Cub games. I was born into a Cub family, I guess you'd say. So I remember all that, and then later, Batman and the Monkees came around, and I remember all that stuff.
Yeah. It was all part of that crucible that we went through, right? Of making us that odd generation that we seem to be to our parents, right?
Yeah.
You were on the air at WXRT, I think, the day John Lennon died, right?
I was.
And that was during your broadcast, am I right?
It was, but it was a specialized broadcast called This Week in Chicago. It was a sponsored show by Tallman Federal, and it was a 1-hour Monday night show in which we spotlighted the bands that were coming to town to play. And so this Lennon death story broke during that hour, during the tail end, and I announced that he had died, but I felt that due to the constraints of the show, I couldn't really play his music at the time because it was dedicated to artists coming to town for that week. So my friend Johnny Mars, when he came on at 10, he took over and gave Lennon the proper tribute, I think, by playing plenty of his music that night. Yeah.
Well, I guess we all felt like we knew John Lennon, probably, one of the most photographed people in history. But did it seem like his death meant more than that?
Oh gosh, I mean, people were calling that night, crying on the phone, "Say it isn't so," that kind of thing to me. Yeah. And I think it's our generation's version of where were you when Kennedy died. I think almost everyone who was around at the time of Lennon's death has a pretty distinct memory of that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, do you think it meant something, more to us than just somebody we liked who died? I mean, do you have any thoughts on that? I'm just curious.
Yeah, the guy was such a figurehead, I mean, he was a true artist, and the fact that he campaigned for peace, he was sort of like, I'm not going to say standing alone, but he definitely dedicated his time to that at a certain point.
Yeah.
He stood alone. He was a unique guy, and I think people innately understood that.
Yeah. After his death, for the next few weeks, I mean, what was it? Did it change what was going on in radio, or did it come up a lot? Was it?
I don't really have a distinct memory if we stayed with it that long.
Yeah.
What is funny, I met Julian Lennon and interviewed him when I worked at the Loop years later.
Yeah.
And he said that his dad said he would send a signal from the afterworld of a white feather floating by. And Julian said he used to look for it and at a certain point gave up.
Yeah.
It was kind of interesting getting that from his son.
Yeah, really. The other piece of that, of course, was I guess a lot of us hoped that at some point the Beatles would get back together, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I wonder if that was so much that we wanted to hear them again, or we were trying to recapture our youth. What do you think?
I don't know what to say. In a way, I
Yeah.
guess it's fortunate they didn't, because you can't live up to those expectations, I think, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, they could have mopped up financially, done a tour, and made zillions of dollars, but they were already rich.
Yeah.
So that was that.
They, I remember hearing a story that they were watching the night that Saturday Night Live made them an offer
Yeah.
to get back together.
Yeah.
And
And
they
John
almost-
and Paul were actually hanging out together in, I guess, Lennon's apartment in New York.
Yeah.
And I don't know if all four of them could have possibly done it, but John and Paul were ready, and the other two might have been in town.
Yeah.
And it came close, but it didn't happen.
Yeah, yeah. So, well, now we can have at least Ringo and Paul, maybe, right? Well, maybe they'll. I think they've done a few things.
Yeah.
So, who's the biggest figure to come out of Chicago? Who do you think's the most important person? Who's our John Lennon
Whoa.
in the music industry? If you had to pick somebody.
Well, I don't think there's another John Lennon coming from anywhere, really.
Well,
I mean,
of
once you
course.
get into the higher, rare air of a Dylan or a Brian Wilson or something, there's not too many left. I mean, in Chicago, there's been different generations of it, okay? Like originally in the 60s, the Crying Shames and the Buckinghams, New Colony Six, American Breed. And then early 70s, there was a big folk boom here with Steve Goodman and John Prine. And then by the time the early 90s rolled around, there was a Smashing Pumpkins and Liz Phair, Urge Overkill, all made national noises.
Yeah.
I think that was the last time there's been really a big Chicago movement.
A lot of really great music came out of those bands and those performers you named, and some influential people, certainly, some important names. But no one person that looms over everyone else.
No, I would not name one.
Yeah, no, I get that. I think that's probably the case, and certainly hard to find anyone else anywhere that compares with Lennon.
Yeah.
There was a survey they did in England, and I think he was the fourth most popular person in England, right before Lord Nelson or something. I don't know. It was the Queen and something like that. Anyway, we're going to take a quick break. The Calumet Roundtable will be right back. Welcome back to the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach. My guest today is Bobby Skafish, the author of We Have Company, 4 Decades of Rock and Roll Encounters. Bobby is the Chicago area disc jockey who has been known probably more than from many of the other stations you've been on, from XRT, I think.
You know what? I spent the longest amount of time there.
Yeah.
2 tours of duty, 20 years.
Yeah, that's very good. We left off talking about the Chicago area bands, and I'd really like to delve into that a little bit here. So you broke this into a couple periods here. Let's look at that first period, the period that brought us the Buckinghams and the New Colony 6, I think, right?
Yeah.
And the Crying Shames.
Shadows of Night, American Breed. Yeah.
I actually didn't know about American Breed. That's interesting. One of the things I discovered recently is that the Crying Shames didn't really have much of an impact outside the Chicago area. I didn't realize that. They never had a number. I think they never had a top 40 hit nationally.
I think that might be right. Their biggest record, It Could Be We're in Love, #1 locally. I think possibly outside of the top 40 nationally. That's true.
Yeah.
Great band, though. Saw them at the Hammond Armory in like 1967.
Yeah. Wow. So, what held them back? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Oh boy,
Don't you think they were pretty much as talented as?
Oh, I love the Crying Shames.
Yeah.
So I'm all over that. But that's out of my area of expertise about what makes a band break and why someone else doesn't.
I was always hanging around with musicians, and they talked about the Crying Shames more than any other Chicago area band at the time. They didn't, nobody was trying to duplicate what the New Colony 6 was doing, but the Shames seemed to be the ones that got the most traction locally, and yet they never made it out of the area. It's always been curious to me. Yeah.
Well, the Buckinghams, I saw them on Ed Sullivan, and they had that big national deal with Columbia. They started actually their first kind of a drag, which was a huge national hit. That was
#1 for weeks, as I recall.
Yeah, that was on a local label actually, and then they got signed to a major, to Columbia after that.
That's right. I remember that label. It was blue with a sort of a burgundy orangish flag on it. Or
That's
something.
it. Exactly.
Yeah. And they had what seemed like a Chicago sound to me because they had the horns. And I was, and then of course this is before Chicago, but now you look back on it, you have to say that the horns are part of that Chicago sound.
I believe the same guy who produced the Buckinghams records, James William Garcio, also then later produced Chicago. But I think horns was associated with Chicago.
Yeah, and I know the Chicago area has always been big into the high school band movement, and I'm sure they fed a lot of people into that. The Buckinghams had a few really good songs. There was what was that Cannonball Adderley?
Mercy, Mercy,
Mercy, Mercy, Mercy. A wonderful, I think, top 10 hit.
I think so. Yeah.
There was just no lyrics, right? And then the Buckinghams put some words to it
Very
and had
good
another
song.
hit with it, right?
Absolutely so.
Yeah, one of their great songs. I saw them recently. North side of Chicago, playing in a park.
No kidding.
Yeah, but. Well, they were part of a really great group of bands. We should do maybe you could be the one to sponsor this. Maybe a Chicago area Woodstock, where we get all these bands together. But what about this next phase? Is that the Chicago phase?
Chicago.
Yeah.
I mean, Chicago had moved out to L.A.
Chicago Transit Authority.
Yeah, they made it out of L.A. So even though they had the name Chicago, they weren't really at that point a local band.
Yeah.
So I think you almost have to skip ahead a few years to when Steve Goodman, author of Go Cubs Go, of course, and John Prine, started making some major noise out of Chicago.
Yeah. And now Goodman was from Chicago. Prine wasn't. Was that?
Prine was from Maywood.
Oh, he was. That's right, because he did a song that he mentions Maywood.
And Goodman was from the Albany Park neighborhood in Chicago.
Okay.
My local post office is now named after Steve Goodman.
No kidding.
Where I live.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. And Steve had that he wrote that hit for Arlo Guthrie.
Yeah, City of New Orleans. Great song. Yeah.
Did you have any encounters with them?
I interviewed John Prine on the air once. This is probably around 1980 or so.
Yeah.
Great guy. Steve Goodman I had never met, but oddly enough, I know his brother David. And as much as Steve was a Cubs fan, his brother David is a White Sox fan.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
So they were playing at the folk clubs. I'm trying to remember. Was Wise Fools one of the
I believe
places?
so.
And
Earl of Old Town. Yeah. Lincoln Avenue was sort of like the center of some of that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. Orphans is another one, I believe.
Yeah, I remember walking down the street and ducking in places, and I think I might have walked in on Steve Goodman singing The Dutchman. And I didn't know who he was, but later on I realized who he was, and I think that's who I walked in on. Yeah. But they were very accessible back then, weren't they?
Yeah. I mean, playing small joints like what we just mentioned.
Yeah.
It wasn't a stadium level kind of thing. It was folk music. It was people's music.
Yeah. And was there a Chicago sound there? I mean, was there something unique about that?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think it's almost happenstance that a couple of talented folk singers came from here.
Yeah. Yeah. They just seem to reflect some of that Second City kind of ambiance of, Middle America.
Yeah, I can dig that.
No glitz.
Yeah.
Yeah. But nothing really since them in the folk music area, right? I mean, you can think of anything.
I would tend to agree with that. There's a talented guy named Robbie Falks who lives in Chicago, who's made some good records and has a national profile, but I don't think he was born here. I think he migrated up here.
Yeah, interesting. And then you mentioned a third phase.
Yeah, early 90s, I mean, these bands started getting signed. Smashing Pumpkins was worldwide success, and Liz Phair and Urge Overkill, I would say that would be the nexus of the early 90s Chicago thing.
Yeah. Of those groups, which one are you most familiar with?
Well, I would say my wife's a big Liz Phair fan, so I think that's how I know all her stuff. And from being on XRT, we played all those bands.
Of course. Yeah.
So, and Pumpkins, I mean, I've met Billy Corgan, who's the leader of Smashing Pumpkins, and still is for that matter.
Yeah.
Sweet guy. So, I know them all a little bit.
What role did XRT have in bringing these people to the foreground, if at all?
Well, XRT had a more eclectic approach to music than the other stations. So that's why the acts that you just named, or that we just talked about, why they got played. That would be more of a XRT thing, just to be more broad-based, more eclectic.
Yeah.
More so than the other rock stations in town.
You mentioned them being eclectic. Did they, when they started out, were they actually somebody's playing classical music?
Oh yeah. I mean, we had featured artists, and you might be featuring, Steppenwolf and Bach or something like that.
I thought I
Absolutely.
remembered that. Yes. Okay.
Which is a little funny for me because I didn't have a classical music background, so I had to fake it a little.
Yeah.
But I knew the Steppenwolf, the Bach not so much.
Yeah. And I thought there was a while there too, something else that was unusual, where they weren't playing canned advertising.
Yeah, when they started out, it was all done live, individual reads by the DJs, and you'd have a record spot, and say you're advertising the new album by America that's at a store. So you would have like 8 seconds to read your first line, and then some vocal music by America would go up, then it would go back down to instrumental bed, and you'd read your next part of the script. And when I first started, I didn't have the hang of it, and I might have been out of sync at times. It's a process you had to learn.
Yeah. Somebody else is from Chicago, Ray Manzarek. Was the organist for the Doors. Tell us a little bit. What do you know about Ray? I'm
such a huge Doors fan. So big fan. I used to actually do an imitation of Ray Manzarek's speaking voice, which I won't trouble anyone with now. But he was coming to the Loop to do an interview, and he brought along with him a poet named Michael McClure. I'm not a big student of poetry, but he's a heavy guy. He came out of San Francisco. He actually co-wrote the lyrics to Janis Joplin's Mercedes-Benz.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but so Ray and Michael McClure show up.
Not a very poetic song, but okay.
And Ray, very pro-Doors, even at that late date, very pro-60s. At the time, he was promoting a new video release by the Doors, so he had a lot of insight. Was very anti the Oliver Stone movie about the Doors, and was not shy about saying it. That jerk, that kind of thing. So he was a great interview.
What do you remember what he said about the Stone movie? Did he think it overemphasized the debauchery of the whole
Long
scene?
story short, he sort of said Stone did not understand the Doors, did not understand the 60s, thought he sensationalized
Well, he did have
things.
a singer who, supposedly urinated on his audience and caused some other problems, but that's okay, Manzarek was was older, I think, than the other
Yes,
members
he
of the
was.
Doors, right? And he actually had a bit of a career going as a jazz musician.
I don't think a really super successful career, but he and Jim Morrison had both gone to the film school at UCLA.
Yeah.
Met on the beach in Venice, and the rest is history, I guess.
Yeah. I have to tell you, the thing that I like most about Doors songs is the organ.
Oh yeah, great instrumentalist.
Yeah, a friend of mine was telling me that the Doors had no bass player, and
Yeah.
so all those organ parts were Manzarek playing with one hand because with the other hand he was playing the bass line, right?
Yeah, either his other hand or foot pedals to
Yeah.
do the bass, one or the other. Yeah.
He was very impressive artist. They did an album after Morrison died that I thought was great.
Yeah, they did actually Other Voices and then Full Circle, and then they called it a day.
Yeah, actually maybe I'm thinking of Full Circle. Yeah, yeah. Someone else born in Chicago that I didn't know until you mentioned it earlier when we were talking was Roger McGuinn.
Roger McGuinn of the Byrds, yeah, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame band, all those great songs, Mr. Tambourine Man, Turn, Turn, Turn. So You Want to Be a Rock and Roll Star. I think he was born on or near Division Street, and he studied folk music at the Old Town School of Folk Music.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So go study at Old Town School of Folk Music and you can become Roger McGuinn.
I guess so.
Yeah, he had an interesting career, and he wrote what I find is one of the most evocative songs in the history of rock, and that's So You Want to Be a Rock and Roll Star. It's got that haunting, melody, counter melody that they're playing in the background, and the girls screaming, and it's just, it's
very well done. And apparently it was sort of written about the phenomenon of the Monkees, like a prefabricated band coming along, a week or two, you make the charts, they'll tear you apart, that kind of thing. It's a great song.
Great song. Okay, that's all the time we have on our program today. Thank you to Bobby Skafish for joining us on the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach. Have a great day.